that skill alone, sitting in interviews and learning to just shut up and let things play out and to not connect, not to put yourself in that person's shoes, but to be willing to just observe it play out, you'll get so much more magic than if you're constantly cutting your own feet off, which I just see people do all the time. It makes me crazy.
Hello, and welcome to The Story Breakdown, a podcast that explores the art and science of documentary storytelling. If you're a filmmaker, editor, or content creator looking to grow your documentary skills, as I am, this show is for you. In this episode, I'm bringing you a conversation that I had with the incredibly talented filmmaker, Evan Bourcier. Evan is a director and DP who works on commercials, music videos, branded content, and documentaries. He lives in Connecticut and runs a production company called Challenger Media House. Evan and I talked about his journey as a filmmaker, his perspective on storytelling, and we also dive into a couple of his documentary projects and look at the process behind them, the decisions that he made as far as the storytelling goes, and what went into making those projects happen. I found this conversation really insightful and helpful, and I hope you do as well. What I love about your style in particular and your work is that you have this ability to combine really beautiful visuals. Like I can tell you've got that cinematography background and that skill, but then you also pair it with a really powerful exploration of human emotions and human experiences and even raw human moments. So that pairing, I feel like, is just so powerful.
Thank you so much, man. I really appreciate that. Yeah, it feels like I have a hard time turning off that DP brain, sometimes to a fault. I don't know if other people run into that, where like I'll see stuff and go like, this is so compelling. I wouldn't have shot it probably. Like I wouldn't have rolled on this because my DP brain would be like, this looks bad. So I almost have to be intentional in rolling that back sometimes. But yeah, the last few years I feel like has just been, especially on the doc side, really focused on these human moments. And for me, I've always loved the magic of bringing together the ability for like production magic to make these cinematic moments, but then finding things that feel undeniably real and sort of playing in this middle space where you almost are like turning your head and going like, this feels super real, but it looks more real than real. Like what's going on here? And, that was for me initially what, a few years ago, I did a lot of these like one take acoustic performance music videos. And that was very much the formula for the magic there, was like, how do you take something undeniably real and then just slosh a bunch of movie magic onto it? And I feel like documentaries, like mini docs for me, have been very similar lately, where it's like, how do we take the presence of like a vlog even, and something that feels so immediate, and then apply the sauce of cinematography and production and everything else, and make this sort of funny middle thing that isn't exactly traditional doc filmmaking. It's not exactly vlogging. It's like a little bit of a hybrid, but it's been a super fun style to explore. So I'm glad people dig it.
Let's give just a little bit maybe of an overview of your filmmaking journey. You do a lot of things.
Some would say too many things.
So tell me a little bit about kind of how you got started and then how you've gotten to where you've gotten to today with filmmaking.
Yeah, so I started when I was 18. I got a Canon T3i for Christmas, and at the time I was just like sort of curious about video. I did not grow up as someone who like had dreams of being a director. I liked film and videos. I was more curious in like animation and stuff growing up, like game design and 3D animation. I wanted to be in the art side and was always really bad at drawing and stuff. And so at some point, like I started playing with 3D stuff, decided it was too monotonous for me. Like it was too much keyframing and pushing things around. And I was like, I don't really love this. And so that was around the time that like I basically fell into it with a few friends. That like my inflection point was really that I was at a high school summer camp with some buddies, and we decided to just like make a funny video on someone's phone. And so they handed me the phone and I started shooting that. Got home and like downloaded a trial of Final Cut 10 and like cut this video in that. And that was the thing that led to like then the church I was working at the time asked me if I'd want to edit some stuff. That caused me to get the camera for Christmas. And then I was just sort of off to the races. I've been working 2 minimum wage jobs at Marshall's and Ace Hardware, just sort of like generic retail stuff. And very quickly was like, the leverage on this camera stuff seems a whole lot higher. Because I had just like a few tiny things where like a friend was like, did senior photos for $100 or whatever it was. And it was like, oh, well, if I could do this at all, this is a way better gig than like getting yelled at for not pushing enough credit cards at Marshall's. And so I just like quit my job and wholesaled myself into figuring it out, not knowing anything about anything. And so, you know, just sort of pulling that thread of like church videos, nonprofit videos. I got to go to Haiti like less than a year in, basically like through church stuff, got asked by a nonprofit to go down to Haiti for 2 weeks. That won a Telly Award and then opened some other doors where I ended up going to Ghana for a feature documentary. But yeah, I feel like I was in the deep end really quick and just figuring it out. Where like I went to this event called Masters in Motion, which was a sort of a film conference workshop thing down in Austin. And I remember getting there, and at this point I'm 19, and meeting all these people who are like, oh, I'm like a producer at National Geographic, and I'm an AC over at Variable, and I'm a, you know, yada, yada, yada. What do you do? And I was like, I don't know what any of this means. Like none of this, you're all speaking Greek to me. And people are talking about, you know, quality of light and Panavision lenses. And I'm just like, whew, it's all way over my head. And I remember actually having this very strong sense of like, not imposter syndrome, but like really questioning myself, going like, I don't know, like I want to shoot things, but like, I don't know that I see light and shots like Khalid sees light and shots. Like him talking about all these things and me just being like, I just don't get it. I don't get this like refracted versus reflected versus yada 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 yada. And so it was a little overwhelming, but for whatever reason it was like, I'm just gonna keep trying to learn, and I'm gonna keep trying to share what I learned, because this whole thing feels like a really big black box. And it was a black box that had just sort of opened because of the DSLR revolution, quote unquote, but it was still a black box, that it was like, the industry is a mystery. How any of this works, no one knows. And so it sort of became my mission that I was like, I want to see how far I can get in this. And I almost want to like leave a little breadcrumb trail behind me for other people who may go on this journey of like, how does any of this stuff work? Because it doesn't seem like there's a playbook. And so I started an online community, which was originally just like, I started that when I was 18, and it was like 5 high school kids that I was like pseudo mentoring. And then one day, like, it's a long story, but that popped off one day, and suddenly, you know, years later, it's a 4,500 person thing. And started doing a podcast similarly to you, just was like, I just want to talk to people. And like 8 episodes in, we were talking to Greg Fraser and Bradford Young, which was just crazy. But so yeah, it's really just been a roller coaster of like doing the next right thing and showing up and trying to like be creative and have a vision and teach people, but not really having like a long-term direction or vision outside of like, I just want to make cool stuff with cool people.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people in this space can resonate with. You know, whether that is documentaries or whether that's commercials or whatever else. So it sounds like though documentaries have been sort of a part of what you're doing for a while. Is there sort of a mentality that you take to when you approach a doc project that's a little bit different from something in another genre? Do you have sort of a set of maybe like, you know, assumptions or first principles or sort of guiding lights that you take to any doc project?
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly, I think it's pretty similar for me across the board. Like, I don't think of documentaries as this very different thing. In many ways, I feel like an outlier in that, like, the way that I think about commercially branded content, whatever stuff, is very much the same as the way I think about documentary stuff. And some people do think of them as very differently. And so, like, one example of that is, I am a very big believer in like tell the story that's there, not the story that's in your head. And I've been on a lot of sets with a lot of agencies and production companies doing, pseudo documentary stuff. And you get to the point where it's like, and here's the big question where we get our big plot point, and the talent's just like, I don't feel that way. And suddenly your story is ruined, and some people double down on, well, can you just say the thing? And I don't like that. I get it that like people are trying to like cross off their bullet points, but I have always been a big believer in digging into the story that's there. And so I think that like the way that I do prep for these sorts of things and the way that I think about it tends to be very curiosity focused. And it's more like, what are the things that are interesting in this space, and how can we pull that thread? How can we pull that thread in real time? Something that's come to me in the last few years has been being more intentional about wanting to create space for moments of mutual realization, where I want the audience and the talent realizing something at the same time together on camera. And so like I'm very careful about like pre-interviews and stuff. I get the appeal of like, oh, I want to have all my ducks in a row, but I don't want to blow those moments. And so I think the way that I do things can be anxiety inducing for a lot of people because it is very loose. And I'm someone who just like trusts the process and the story enough that I'm very comfortable in that, like, we don't know exactly what we're going to make, and that's okay. But yeah, I feel that way, even going into the more commercial side. I mean, a lot of the commercial work that I've done still has a strong degree of doc flavor. I've done some like boarded 60s and 30s and stuff, and that's fun. I would honestly love to do more of that, but most of it still ends up being some form of like reality based. And even on that side, I was just in Vegas on a job, and me and the producer were talking about it, that it's like, I feel like there's this world where for a ton of stuff, you either need like the whole shebang of a production that's like, we have art department, we have talent, we have yada, 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 and we're going to go like dial everything in and make it perfect. Or you should have like two people, no like client on set, no agency producer on set. And whether that's like a corporate thing or I did this project back during COVID that I was really proud of for this waste and recycling company that was like a thank you video to their employees. And that was our approach. We had 3 days of no shot list and me just getting an all access pass to their facilities. And that was the best move, because the minute that you start bringing in a gaffer and go, oh, we need a moment of this person walking into this door, like it all just gets hokey really fast, in my opinion. And I've shot a million of those things, but I find that like you either need to be comfortable with the like, we're literally going to hawk moments and we're going to sit here and just wait for it, which is something that I feel like I learned going all the way back to Haiti when I was 18, is like, you're not directing people in the, in these doc situations. You get very good at seeing the moments and anticipating the moments. Or you go all the way to the game of like, we're totally controlled. Here's your emotional beat. Here's, the marks. And that a lot of stuff ends up in this awkward middle world where we're trying to control it and just making it worse. And so I think that's like, I guess just coming back to the question of like my approach in documentary, I skew very much towards that thing of like, let's either make it very real or very produced, and like the middle ground is where I feel like so much stuff lives these days, and I personally think most of it's garbage.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because when you start to try to mix that, it's sort of like that control versus the sort of discovery, like you were saying, and when you start to mix them, it can get weird.
I think you can feel the inauthenticity of it a lot of the time too. And it's like when you get enough control, the inauthenticity is irrelevant. Like it's a totally curated, created, like a Geico commercial doesn't have to feel authentic.
Yeah. And the audience understands that.
Right. But when you get into this weird middle world where it's like, I mean, that's where like I have all these pet peeves. I could do I should just do a video series on like pet peeves, but like I'm of the controversial opinion that no one needs to know your name and what your role is here. Like this whole trope of us going like, my name's Daryl and I'm the account manager at so-and-so. It's like, ugh, I don't know. There's just all these little pieces of how we do things, and put the question back in the answer is like another one that's just like, it gives you really safe sound bites for a short form edit. But to me, it never feels human. And to have a bunch of people going like, my favorite part of working at, Don Gerald Ford is that every family comes first. It's just like, I don't know. To me, there's just like, there's always a more human level that you can get to. And the sentiment is valid. Like the question of like, what is important here? And the idea that it may be family or community is all valid. But to me, that decision to go like, the most important thing to us is family, it just makes it so plasticky, and it makes it so unreal feeling. And you can sit there and check the box. It's like, we talked about community and what's important. But I'm someone who feels very strongly about like, what's the question behind the question? Like, what is the thing beneath that? And so even for those people, like, what does that mean? What's an example of how that community has showed up for you? Or, it's hard with a theoretical example, but I think that's another thing, whether it's on the true doc side or skewing more into the like commercial corporate space, coming back to the like tell the real story, is like understanding the sentiments that you're trying to get to, understanding what's important and resonant is super important. But a lot of the times you have to be willing to discover that thing in real time with that person again, and that it's really tempting to just like make a quick checklist and to go like, we need them to talk about these 3 things and we need to get these 4 moments that sort of capture it. And it's like, you've technically done the job, but it's all just very thin feeling. And so that's another thing that like I just come back to is like, how do we add more depth to this visually? Like, how do we show community in a deeper way than 3 people sitting around a break room table? How do we, like there's all this sort of tropey, like this technically checks the box, and just going like, what's the deeper thing here? What's the question behind the question? What's the real emotional note here? And every time you hit it, you've hit it. But it's a little bit more of a dance. Like interviews become a little bit more of a dance and less about pre-written questions for me. And like finding those B-roll moments becomes more of a dance, and it's more of a real-time exploration. And yeah, I guess that's just like a process thing that I've personally experienced the spectrum of. And whenever I get back to being the one who gets to determine how we do it, I always find myself trying to put more room for exploration in, and to really find those resonant things.
So how does that, when you have a brand involved, and a lot of times they have their, whatever goals that they're trying to accomplish with this particular campaign or whatever, but it's in that documentary style or documentary world, how do you sell them on that idea of following the curiosity rather than just, a preset, list of story beats or whatever? Is it just trust, or is there a strategy there as well in terms of navigating that with a brand?
I mean, I think trust is a massive part of it, and trust comes in a few ways. Like there's the trust element of seeing the work and seeing the process, and just going like, on a base level, are you in or are you out? Like, do you like what you see? Do you feel like it is meaningfully different, and is this something that you're actually curious about exploring? Because if they don't want that, like if they want the check the 3 boxes thing, I believe it's not worth trying to sell them on anything else. But if they're like, no, we see this stuff and we want it to be more resonant, we want to work with someone who has a different process, then you have to be willing to own that trust. And I've seen a lot of people almost back themselves out of that, where they have a client that trusts them, and they start coming back to the client with all these questions of like a million versions of, well, what do you want us to do? And it's like, you don't have to ask. Like if they trust you, just make the decisions. And I think the other side of that is, this was actually like an epiphany that I had recently talking to another friend about sales and client conversations, is that I don't want to say ever, but I don't really talk about creative with clients. I don't really pitch ideas. I have, since I was 18 and 19 walking into things, like I've always been very intentional about, I want to understand this thing, whatever the thing is, whether that's, I want to understand this college, I want to understand this athlete, I want to understand this, local fish market. Like I want to understand the business, I want to understand the brand, I want to understand everything about this thing. And some clients it freaks out because I will ask them everything from, what's your, businessy math questions sometimes to just like, where's the margin on this? How do you, whatever. And like, I really want to understand what they're doing. And I think that with people who are willing to trust you again, at the end of the day, there's this sense of like, my job is to understand your part of the equation and then to do my part of the equation. And so I'm not actually going to sit here and pitch you on like how the sausage is made or my process or anything else. I'm going to leave that like you either like what you see on the work site or you don't. And then my job is to understand you. And I think if people like what they see and they feel understood, then there's a lot more room for trust. And I've seen a lot of creatives come in right away with their like creative pitch. This is what we're going to do. This is our process. This is yada, yada, yada. And the clients don't feel understood. And I've been on sets where honestly, it's like, no one understands what's going on here. Like this is broken on paper. We're asking questions that don't make sense during interviews because we just don't understand the thing. Someone just came in and sold a project and didn't take the time to understand it. And that hurts my heart a lot personally. But like, I find that like the element of going like showing understanding, being really curious from the gun, being able to identify in real time in that conversation, like that's an interesting thing. And also you're just like inherently in that conversation demonstrating your ability to be curious and identify valuable things. And so you don't have to like necessarily call it out. That's like, look, I'm showing you that I know how to ask intelligent questions. But I think there's an element of trust that comes out of that. And so all of that comes together to like, it's never been an overly explicit thing for me to have to go like, oh, this is my process. It was more like when I started working on like bigger agency sets and whatever, I was confused at how prescripted everything was, that I was like, oh, I've not done this and I've not felt obligated to do this. And it feels weird that we have like all this paperwork and all these boxes we're trying to check off and none of it feels really resonant and no one knows what's going on. Like, I was just more often than not, I think I thought I was going to be like impressed by the like process of like the quote unquote legit stuff. But most of it, I was just like, I don't really like this.
So obviously there's that aspect of like, when you can have that trust and sort of, pursue that the curiosity side more on that creativity aspect, it's more fulfilling for you and you feel like you produce a better product in terms of, the end video. Have you seen instances where, that type of approach has worked better for brands as well? Not just like, because when you do that sort of more canned approach, the end product everyone can see is not as enjoyable, but is there an effectiveness aspect too, where if you're telling a more heartfelt, more human, more raw story, people are going to actually connect with the brand more? Is that something that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, boy, the places you could take that. I mean, I that's that the problem is that it's not always available information in like short-term data, right? Because like at the end of the day, a view is a view. A view does not account for how the person felt at the end of the thing. A view does not account for so many factors. And so it's a harder thing to put a tangible number-based metric on, and we're especially in the social media era of creation, like so KPI based with everything. And I personally hate it because I just think it's a very shallow way of measuring things. And even what's going on now with like so much social content that is just very much that like hyper canned, here's the 3 steps to have a quote unquote piece of content or tell a story, and it's not grounded in reality or the truth. Like so much of this advice content now is like it's not even true. People are just saying things. But it gets views, and like I personally believe that in the long run it's going to burn out hard. It's going to eradicate trust in the platforms. I don't trust the platforms anymore. I don't know if anything that I'm seeing is real ever, and that doesn't even account for the AI element of it. But like I even just see things that are like, did you know whatever? Like I see people giving film advice that's just like factually incorrect constantly, and it's like, okay, this is the danger of everyone having the ability to give advice. So there's my old man yelling at the cloud moment. But I think that at the end of the day, I think of it from a user experience perspective. And the simple measurement for me is like, which would I rather watch? Which is like another painfully simple thing that I feel like we've just lost the plot on, is just like, I want to make things that I would want to watch. And if we're making something that none of us want to watch, what's the point? And it's like, it's a scary question to ask because I think it forces us to face that like tons of stuff that's getting made no one actually wants to watch. But in many ways, I think it's a very powerful question, because if we were actually just making things that we wanted to watch, I think the world would be a better place. And that comes back to the commercial and advertising space too. Like when I was younger, commercials were sick. Like commercials were inspiring. I wanted to work on commercials because they were cool and fun and funny and inspiring. And like for the most part, commercials now just suck. It's like they're annoying. The ads are annoying. It's just like, it always feels like it's trying to twist your arm. It's rarely actually entertaining. It's probably BS and someone white labeling some garbage from China if it's on social media. Like it's just, I just don't like it. And so I choose not to participate in any of that. But the long-winded way to come back to your question, I think that like in the long run, people continually engage with brands that they connect with. They engage with personalities that they connect with. And there's a lot of short-term leverage games you can play to move some of the number-based levers that we consider valuable. But it's been shown time and time again that even people who get TikTok famous, you can have someone with a couple million followers, and the minute they go to do anything like live and in person, no one shows up. Because at the end of the day, their whole connection is like, I like the thing you do on my little dopamine box, but like my connection past that is irrelevant. And I think we're seeing that too, even with like the short form platforms are becoming so, I don't want to say isolated. I don't know what the word is, but like they're not converting, because at the end of the day, like the way Reels and TikToks and YouTube Shorts work now is like you don't follow accounts really, right? You like double tap the thing and swipe on. And so we're not generating connections. Your goal is to make something that a bunch of people double tap on and then move on. And even like short form podcast clips. Like I've had short form podcast clips that'll pop off a couple 100,000 views, and 20 of those people convert to the actual episode. So like people are acting like short form is the holy grail, and it's like it's an ends to its own means. Like it used to be like, oh, I can connect people back to the real thing, and people don't even want the real thing anymore. They just want the endless feed of little things. And I'm not going to make any sort of like philosophical judgment of whether the little things themselves are good or bad, but the amount of actual depth and connection is pretty limited. And so like for me, the simplest case study in this is if you go, one of the docs that I did recently is called In the Arena, and it was about a CrossFit athlete named Chandler Smith. It's on YouTube. It's free to watch. And if you go to that video, just read the comments. And the number of comments that are just like people going, this is what we miss about storytelling. And like, we're so tired of the YouTube showy algorithm stickiness of it all. And like, this just feels real. I think the comments speak for themselves. People, for whatever reason, will choose not to listen to that and will keep making what they're making. But I think that every time anything like that gets put out, you will see the connections, you will see people yearning for more of it. And then unfortunately, it is like a hard sell to people sometimes now, because it's not as guaranteed as doing like another get ready with me in the morning TikTok that's definitely going to get you 50,000 views, but is it going to build any long-term connections? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that deepening of connection is a big advantage of, sort of longer form documentary content that just isn't there with a lot of video content on the internet. And I'm glad you mentioned In the Arena, because that's kind of where I wanted to go next. So when I came across that film, I am not a gym rat. I don't know the first thing about CrossFit. I don't know who Chandler Smith is, but I watched it and it was so interesting to me, because it's not just about the athletics. It's about the human story that's there. And that's what drew me in. Even though I don't know, the first thing about CrossFit or weightlifting or whatever. So let's talk about this project a little bit and dive into, what went into making that happen. So how did that come about? How did you get involved with that?
So a few years back, I was, part of my story was that I don't even know exactly when it was, 5 or 6 years ago, I was very burnt out in my career. I was overweight, stretched thin, and that was when I sort of backburnered a whole lot of stuff I had been doing on the internet, shut down my podcast, archived the Facebook group, took a month off work, deleted my Instagram. And one of the things was like, I'm going to therapy and I'm going to get in shape. And I was just like doing my whole internet YouTube rabbit hole thing. And YouTube was really where I found out about CrossFit. And there was this web doc series called Road to the Games that was like 10 to 20 minute episodes. And they went around and followed all of these CrossFit Games athletes in like the lead up to the CrossFit Games every year. And I was just binging these things. And like, I found the stories fascinating. I found the sport fascinating. I really liked the production of it and was like, I just want to get into this. So I ended up going to our local CrossFit gym. Like, I just went on Google and basically was like, hey, I'm interested in doing this. And I'm like interested in trading services. And so I did CrossFit for the next like 3 years and just did photo and video stuff for our local gym. Got super connected there. But so the like doc series was what got me into CrossFit. And I ended up connecting with the guys who were doing those documentaries. And long story short, like a year and a half later, they needed help at the CrossFit Games doing the latest documentary, and I ended up going out to the games with them and working on the 2019 games doc, which is out on, I think it's out on like Netflix and stuff now. But that was surreal. That's another one of those just weird life experiences where like I was the audience, and then so shortly later, like I was just in the movie. Like, it's weird to be like at an event with all the people from the movies where you're like, oh, I know all of these characters. I know, like, I don't know. It was a very surreal moment, and very cool for me because it was a story in a sport that had made a difference in my life. And, I'd lost 70 pounds and done a whole bunch of other stuff. But so I basically stayed in touch with those guys for a while. CrossFit ended up firing their whole media team and they stopped all the doc projects. And so Heber and Marston started a YouTube show kind of on accident. It was originally like a side hustle while they were going to keep working on docs, and the YouTube thing got bigger than the docs. And so that's sort of their focus at this point. But we had been in touch and I'd worked on a few things with them over the years, and there had been this sort of recurring theme of like, would you be interested in almost like taking the reins over on a Road to the Games type project? Because we know people still want these things. We're being pulled in different directions and just have different priorities, but we still have access to all the athletes. And, for whatever reason, they were like, you seem like the kind of person who could tell those kind of stories. And I was foaming at the mouth, like, yes, please let me do this. Like, this is the perfect thing for me. And so we talked about it for like a year or so, didn't end up happening. And then they were like, we really want to do one of these this year. And I forget what the format was. I think it was just like, who do you most want to do one with? And Chandler was local-ish to us. He was training in Boston, which is like, they were like an hour and a half away from us. And we were waiting to see who would get seeded where with semifinals, because like budget-wise, we weren't going to go to like Spain, or there's a bunch of them all over the place. But so we were like, okay, like who's going to be local? So Granite Games was in Minnesota. And yeah, it was just sort of like, to the earlier point, it was very much like, make whatever you want. We trust you. Pick someone who's interesting. Pick a story you want to tell. I think the edict was like, it should be at least like 15 minutes long for YouTube at that point. But they were like, outside of that, we don't really have, we don't care, but like, we just trust you. Make whatever you want to make. And so I called up my buddy Toby, who was also like, we had been talking just through Instagram and stuff. He was another film guy. He was a CrossFit guy, and he was in Minnesota. And I was like, hey, is there any world where you would want to come like be cam op some stuff at the Granite Games? And he was like, I literally just wrote down on my calendar, like Granite Games, like I'm going to find a way to do something there. And whether I go volunteer or whatever else, like I want to do something there. Which is like, I'm not a big, like, I'm not woo-woo on the like manifestation side of things, but there's definitely a weird element of like my life with like having ideas and saying things and then just all the doors opening and going like, this is weird. But yeah, so we had to figure out how to make a doc on not a lot of money and not a lot of time. It was a story that I was passionate about, but wanted to come back to that more human element, the inside story of like, okay, the athlete experience is interesting, but so many of these videos are focused on scores, times, events, weights. And so very early on, you know, my conversation with Toby was like, I don't want to focus on any of that. Like that, it has to be there in some ways, like because of the conceit of the event, but we're gonna do it as a little bit of like a, and then this other stuff happened, and here's the numbers, and then back to what's actually going on. And so we were sort of intentionally flipping the event format of going like, instead of focusing on the events, we were going to focus on everything around the events. Instead of focusing on the whole weekend, we were going to be intentional about, we're only going to focus on Chandler and like his perspective going through this weekend. So we're not really going to talk about qualifying in Granite Games and where people are on the leaderboards. We're going to focus entirely on Chandler's experience. And for me, the main thing that I was curious about going into it was, I knew that Chandler was an incredibly kind person. I'd met him previously. I knew that he was an incredibly fit person. And I knew that he had a weird head game with himself. You could see it like in things he would post on his Instagram stories and stuff, where you're like, he was like, here's the face of someone who couldn't cut it as a D1 football player or something. And I was just like, that's interesting. And I relate to that as someone who's had my own forms of imposter syndrome, whatever. But like, that was the thread that I was really curious to pull, was like, what is Chandler's relationship to himself and other people's perspectives of him? Because he's definitely someone who can also get chirped by the audience. He's strong almost to a fault sometimes. Like, he's not the prettiest, most technical Olympic weightlifter. He was a super high-end wrestler, and he has all sorts of wrestler body mechanics that come out in weightlifting. But like, the commentators will say stuff about like, that's the ugliest thing I've ever seen. And so I was like, what's it like to be an athlete at this level and to have people saying things about you, to have the pressure of all of that? Your dad was a pro football player, you're cutting it as a CrossFit player. But like, that was the big overarching like thing I'm curious about. Back to the like discovery thing, was like, I have no clue what's going to go on this weekend, but this is the story I want to tell. I want to focus on Chandler, what's going on in his head, and how does that all play out. And we get to Minnesota, and we're going through check-in, we're going through just like, you know, the beginnings of the weekend. We get to event one, and he just like explodes. And it was really funny because he was immediately down, and I think a lot of other people were very confused. And I was like, I was secretly giggling inside because I was like, this is a way more interesting story already. Like, the last thing the world needs is another. And then I came and got first place by a 1,000,000-point story. And so I was bummed for Chandler, but I was immediately curious about like what is actually going on. And it very quickly became clear that no one knew what was going on. His coach didn't know what was going on. He didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what was going on, which was an interesting thing to try and capture in like the edit of that too, because it can be really easy to tell everything from this like looking back perspective where you have all the answers. But for me, another important part of that story was trying to capture this feeling of being in a uncomfortable position where no one has answers and there's no good decisions. That it's like there's no simple, do you quit or do you go on? Does it get worse? Does it get better? Are you having a panic attack or are you having some sort of physical thing? Because that was really like the conversations that were even going on off camera was like, Chandler says he doesn't know what's going on. Is he now just having continual panic attacks because he blew up in the first event and he's like in his own head? Or is he having some sort of physical thing? And, you know, it's, I mean, I'm fine spoiling it, but we don't have to spoil it. But it ended up coming out after all of that. It was like weeks later when we did the interview with him after the event that he finally came out and told me like, hey, I've had asthma since I was a little kid, but I've never told anyone because I thought that people were gonna like isolate me basically. Like people would say that like, oh, your inhaler's a steroid. And he's like, I'm already a big guy and people say things about me and steroids and I've never taken them. But like if I told them I had an inhaler, then they'd, you know, definitely. And it's like he had this whole story in his head. And, you know, he wanted so badly to be like a Green Beret or something, I forget, Special Forces, but he couldn't because he had asthma, and so he still went to basic, and he snuck his inhaler into basic. He like cut it in half and hid it in a wall somewhere so that he would like have it just in case. But part of his story was he was like, the whole reason that I started doing CrossFit was I wanted to be so fit that I could get through basic with an asthma attack. Which is crazy because he's still got 11th at Granite Games against the fittest dudes in the country in the middle of a weekend-long asthma attack. And so it was, I don't know, it was a fascinating story to tell, and I feel like I'm probably rambling at this point, but it was, to me, it was a perfect setup of going like, what's the curiosity, what's the thread that we want to pull? And that for me, that framing was exactly the thing that like the weekend immediately curved sideways, and I had people on at the location being like, aren't you worried? And I'm like, no, this is great. This is like exactly... Not great. I don't know. I almost feel like that sounds like a exploitative thing, but it's just like this is real now. We're playing, we're really dancing now, and we're really getting these real moments, you know, backstage with him and with his coach and whatever else, and like there's nothing fabricated about this, and those sorts of stories are very easy to go show up, crush everyone, I won. And for me, that was another thing that I was just excited about, was like so many CrossFit docs had been done on Matt Fraser, who's another awesome dude who won 5 years in a row by a 1,000,000-point margin. And I was like, no one tells the story of the guy who loses. And so I'm actually way more excited as a filmmaker at the opportunity to tell the story of a high-end athlete getting his teeth kicked in by something out of his control, because people don't make that movie because it doesn't crush the algorithm. But yeah, so that's, I don't even know that I answered your question, but that's some of my thoughts on In the Arena.
No, that's awesome. I noticed, so right off the bat, you start that film with, you know, you kind of get Chandler's perspective after the fact and how he's not, you know, maybe not pumped on the story because he's like, nobody cares about the loser. And what that did for me watching was all of a sudden I'm no longer watching wondering, okay, how did the event turn out? Did he win or did he lose? I'm still interested in that, but I'm also like, okay, why did this happen? And it's like you introduced right off the bat another layer of interest that kept me going through the story. I'm sure that was, you know, absolutely intentional, but I'm wondering what went into that, you know, in terms of the structuring of the story. What was your thought process behind starting it that way?
Yeah, so for me, that was super intentional because it's twofold. So one thing is, you think about it from an audience perspective. Like the core audience for that film when it comes out, they already know that Chandler didn't qualify. And so for us to play the like will he won't he card is kind of silly in my opinion. And people still do it. I was just watching the U.S. Women's National Team doc series on Netflix, and they sort of are able to hold that like will they won't they card a little bit, because I'm part of the audience that doesn't follow them enough to know do they do they win the World Cup or not. But for this, it's like, okay, so the core audience knows. And so for me, from that point, it was like the story isn't really does he qualify. It's answering the question for all the fans of what the heck happened. Because literally from like a press perspective, no one knew what had happened. Like you can watch the live stream from Granite Games and the commentators going like, what is going on with this dude? Like he looks like he's in pain. What's going on? And so I was like, the fundamental framing is what the heck happened. And so then when we got to that interview, I think it's the first question I asked him is like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how over this are you? And he goes like, 11, I'm Spinal Tap level. So like, and then he just goes into his, no one wants to watch the movie about the lovable loser. But for me, that was part of the the sort of meta conversation that it opened up. Was there's this whole theme of him saying no one wants to watch a video about someone losing. And when we got to the end of Granite Games, it's in the end of the film, but like he literally came up and he's like, I'm really sorry that I wasted all your guys' time. Like none of this is going to be usable. I know you came out here to film me win, and I just like, I blew it for you, and none of this is going to be able to go anywhere. And I was like, not true. maybe unfortunately for you, I'm sure there's a part of you that doesn't want any of this to go anywhere at this point, but like that's not the point. And so for me, that's another thing that struck, I think, I would call it like a collective consciousness chord of like, you've put your finger on something that we don't talk about, which is that we only film videos about people winning. And that the general story structure of most of these things is based around the struggle to succeed, right? That it's like, here's my journey. I'm this amount of time out from whatever my big competition is. I'm going to either qualify, go to the Olympics. Like it's always about winning. And I felt very strongly early on that I was like, there's something really funny about how we tie the audience's hands if you immediately go like, he doesn't win. And not only does he not win, he doesn't understand why anyone would watch a video about someone not winning. And like that little bundle to me is the thing that makes you go, well, now I have to watch this. Like what the heck, if it's not him winning and he doesn't think it should exist, what is it? And it is like, I think it's one of the more clever things I've ever done in a film. But I talked to Heber and Marston about it, and they were sort of like, it kind of spoils the thing. And I was like, no, it doesn't. It's like, I'm going to die on this hill. This is the thing that makes it compelling. This is the story in a nutshell. It contains Chandler's self-image issues, his perception of himself in the story, our cultural obsession with telling stories about people winning. Like it's a perfect little encapsulation of what the film is. And then we're able to perfectly spit you back out into, event 1, Chandler explodes, now what? And so, yeah, for me, it all sort of ties back into that thing of like, what is this story about? And it's not really a story about the Granite Games at all. It's not even in some ways a story about Chandler. It's more this meta conversation around the stories we tell, the way we perceive success, the way we perceive factors that are inside and outside of our control. And being the human being who has to live through these often uncomfortable decisions in the pursuit of something you care about.
Yeah. How involved was Chandler throughout the process in terms of like, being involved in the story and making decisions on what to focus on, and like what did that interaction with the character look like?
It was pretty passive. So basically, like, from a production perspective, um, he the Heber and Marson told Chandler, they had sort of been like, hey, we want Evan to do this thing. Him and I had connected one other time and been on social media before and seen each other on Instagram and stuff. And we connected. I don't really know why. I just know that, like, they were like, he's excited that you're doing it. And, like, if you weren't doing it, he probably wouldn't do it. Which is another, I think, small example of just, like, the trust thing being super critical. But, like, for me, that was a really important element of all of it. So, like, I went up to Natick one day, a few days out from the Granite Games, which is when the, like, Jesse and Chandler training on the field scene happens. I met up with them out there, and that scene was really important to me because it captures something that you don't get during the weekend, which is that you need to see Chandler and Jesse not under stress. Because so much of that weekend, you're getting this very, like, existential dread version of Chandler, which most people I don't think ever get to see. But for the audience that doesn't know him, I was like, you have to see that he's not like this. Like, you have to catch a little bit of the essence of, like, him and Jesse's silly, goofy, you know, we're both super fit savages with 12 packs, but we're also just, like, goofballs thing. And so that was part of why that scene felt really important to me to include. But after that scene, we basically, like, went out and got Sweet Green together, and him and I just talked for, like, 2 hours. And we were talking about all sorts of things, from just, like, the economics of being an athlete in CrossFit right now, and, you know, documentary storytelling and being a Black athlete in the space. And I think just, like, having really honest conversations that, again, weren't all super focused on the movie, but were more like, I just want to understand you as a person, was where I feel like he was very quickly like, you tell the story you're going to tell, you know, like, I trust the story you're going to tell. But yeah, so he wasn't really super involved because basically then we go to Minnesota. He's blacked out half the time. Like, he would just disappear, which is another thing that, like, he would finish an event, go to his hotel, and I would be like, I hope he's going to show up again. But, like, there was literally moments that we were like, is he done or not? Like, is he just going to, like, throw the towel in and that's the end of the thing? And so, like, our interaction was very limited and was pretty much me silent partnering him and being like, I'm not even going to say a single word to you. Like, I'm just here. You're in the back room with the towel over your head, like, trying to get yourself out of a panic attack. And there was one or two moments, which I think are also in the film, where he's like, I can't do this right now. And I was like, okay, fine. Which that's a thing that I also feel very strongly about, that I told him at the beginning was, I really want to capture the fullness of this and the authenticity of this. And it's my job in that relationship to push. And I'm going to be on you. And I just need you to know that it's all, my only intention is for you to look good and the best that you can. Like, this is not gotcha journalism. And if at any point it's too much, tell me to f off. And I will. I totally respect that. That is a button that you have. And I think that's a very important button to actually give someone, because, and he took advantage of it like twice, but because then now there's just an awareness that, like, this is an agreement. We're in this together, and we're in the discomfort of it together. But I think that safety was really important as things went out the way that they did. You know, we were saying that before we knew how crazy things were going to get. But yeah, I mean, literally we got to the end and he has his conversation with Ben. And we had a very brief conversation there where I stopped rolling and he apologized to me again. And I told him, like, I'm someone who lost my last ever wrestle off. And that was the end of my sport of wrestling. Like, you end on a loss. My best friend missed NCAA finals by 1/10 of a pound and had to sit out, and then had a kid and never went back to it. I was like, there's so many people who are going to relate to this story so much more than Matt's story or anyone else's story. And I get where you're coming from, but like, this is real. And I'm crying at this point. And it was the only time all weekend that I saw him cry too, actually. And we just sort of got up and hugged each other, and he left, and that was the end. And I didn't talk to him for like a week after that. And then we ended up connecting to go back and do this sort of like exit interview thing. And so that was another thing that I was intentional about, was like, I want all the in the moment stuff to feel totally in the moment and force the audience to be in this perspective of, we only know what we know right now, which is basically nothing, but that the other stuff is clearly retrospective, and that we're sort of meshing these perspectives. There's a little bit of timeline jumping going on, right? Where like the stuff at the soccer field is before the event, the interview is happening after the event, but it's all very clearly delineated, which I felt like was important, because sometimes people get murky with that it's like, what, who knows what, where. But yeah, his biggest involvement at that point was that he sort of still felt like it shouldn't come out. Like, he was like, I don't know why we're doing this. And I was like, just trust me. And like, up to the day it came out, like, he was still like, I don't know that I want this out there. Like, I don't, people aren't going to like it. He was like, I'm going to look like a crybaby. Like, people are going to think I'm making excuses for my loss, yada, yada. And I was like, dude, you're not. Like, I get it, but you're not. Like, please, please, please trust me. This is only good things. And somehow, for whatever reason, but this is like literally, I'm having 3-hour phone calls with him like the week before it comes out, and being like, please just let us put this movie out. I'm not going to tell you have to let us put this movie out, but I need you to believe me that I hear everything that your crazy brain is telling you about how you're a horrible person, and none of it's true. And we put it out, and he texted me after reading the comments, and he was like, I guess you were right. Which was another funny, just back to the brand connection question of like, the vulnerability of it's real, right? Like, and that's why a lot of brands don't want to do it. That's why a lot of individuals don't want to do it. Like, it's appealing to go out there and say, I'm the best in the world at everything. And it's really scary to go out there and to be like, this stuff gets really painful and personal and whatever else. But to see the comments roll in of people with asthma saying like, this has literally inspired me, that like I can do things. He went to an event a few months later, the Rogue Invitational, and there was a kid there with a sign that said it's Chandler time. And he ended up going over and meeting this kid after an event. And the mom said, I'm going to forget the exact story, but it was basically something to the effect of like, I think the kid had asthma. The kid hated school. He like was he was just like a lot of trouble, not engaging with his life. And he saw the story, and he was like, if Chandler can do that, then like I can do what I've got to do. And he became like a massive Chandler fan, which is where they went to this thing. But the mom was like, he's totally like turned around his little kid life because of this story. And for me, that's the prize. Like, view counts are irrelevant. Like, I'll take 5 of those comments and we won. And that for me is the metric of success. And that is why I tell stories the way that I tell stories, is because of that, because I was the recipient of that. Like, I'm someone who has had stories that have inspired me and changed my life. And at the end of the day, that's what I think we're all playing for. And it's the thing that really annoys me, honestly, about a lot of the conversation now, is it has become so shallow and vapid and view count based and hook based and whatever else. And it's like, I didn't get into this for any of that. Like, I want to tell real stories that connect people in a way that can change their life. Maybe it doesn't change their life, but like, I think it has every ability to, when you're brave enough to tell the truth. And so that for me was the measure of success there, was seeing people go like, this inspired me, whether as an asthmatic, as a Black athlete, as someone who's been disabled. Like, I don't know. I think to me, that's the whole ball game, and everything past that's just bonus.
Yeah. It's almost like that story, you know, when told well, can then create or be the impetus for other real life stories happening, and people overcoming their own obstacles. And it's that sort of chain reaction that's the actual impact of the film.
Right. Totally.
So let's get logistical for a minute and talk about like production. So you said you had another camera operator who was there with you at the event. So what did your plan look like for capturing like, you know, things that are happening? You captured some of the like announcers. What was your plan going into that event for how you were going to actually capture what you needed to?
Yeah, so that first, I had a call with Toby once he was in, and for me, you know, so there's like the curiosity thread element of it, right? That's like, what's the resonant thing we're going to be pulling? And then there's like, from a production perspective, how do we amplify and double down on that? And a lot of the times it's easier to start with what are we not going to do? And so like we very quickly decided we're not gonna cover other athletes at all. We're just going to focus on Chandler. If there's a conversation, we're only focusing on the Chandler half of the conversation. We're not filming other athletes during events. Like we're not, whoever's in first is irrelevant. We're just focusing, on what Chandler's doing. We were talking about like what's some other cool, like creative event stuff you could do. And we were like, oh, you could do like some really long lens tripod stuff. And then we were like, partially, honestly, it was just a logistics question of just like moving gear in base camp and not knowing what we were going to be walking into and like how much access we were going to have, that we were like, we're just going to not. So we just decided to do 2 FX6s and 24-70s. We ran glimmer glasses. I've gotten really big on like these little sort of dock rigs. So like I have an on-camera shotgun mic, and then I was running a Rode Lav, like the little Goes. I just got the new ones actually, which I'm excited about. They have those like 32-bit float ones, but it drives me crazy that people just like hold them now. I don't know if you've seen this. People like they're everywhere. People put them on their necks. People put them on hats. I still put an actual like mic into it, and then there's this company called I guess it's called Ursa, but these Ursa sticky things, and so it's like a circle piece of like double-sided tape, and then on the other side there's like a little furry thing that's like a wind blocker. But I'll basically prep that so I would have the mic in my pocket with the actual lav on it, and I would already have a furry thing and a sticky thing on it. And so like Ben, Chandler's coach, was I think the only person we really mic'd. But I would come see Ben once in a while, and I would just pull it out, pull the sticky thing off. He'd pull his shirt up, I'd stick it on his chest, and then we'd just go. And so like that's something that I've started doing a lot over the last few years, is just like having prepped lavs on me. But yeah, 24-70s. Toby had a 100-400 as well, I think. But basically, from like a production perspective, Toby pretty much was focused on floor stuff, because the way it ended up working out at the event, with like the athlete warm-up area, I spent most of my weekend in the athlete warm-up area just because of the way the story was unfolding. And so we made the decision that it was like, Toby's going to focus on event stuff and just get like cool event footage. I'm going to grab some of that, but I'm really focused on just like being on Chandler's hip all the time. And so that was sort of how we divvied up responsibilities there. He also grabbed some of the like establishing, venue scenics type stuff. But yeah, I mean, it was mostly like we would show up each day and have sort of a sense of the events, and heat times, and we would connect sort of at base camp and just texting each other. But the focus was for him to capture all of that event stuff, which he did an awesome job with. It was really fun working with Toby, because he was one of those guys that just like, I feel like our styles immediately meshed. Like we didn't have to talk that much, it's just like the way that he's shooting this is exactly the way that I would shoot this. And so he had some awesome like long lens tracking, high speed stuff that's just like, oh, this is super cool. But yeah, I don't know. What are there other specific questions on like the production logistics side?
Yeah, no, that covers a lot of it. There's one specific scene that I wanted to ask about. You mentioned the training sequence, and there's one there's one spot where you have, it's like 3+ minutes of a oneer where you're just following Chandler doing this workout. It's all one take, and you're switching to different angles. You're doing different, you're going up, you're going down. It's super impressive that like you don't miss the entire time. You're not just, it's not a safe oneer where you're just sitting there and watching it unfold. You're actually in there with the action, but you're catching everything, and it's so like, it's just engrossing. And it makes what could be a really boring 3-minute shot really interesting. And I'm curious, like, what is going through your mind as you're filming that, as you're making those micro decisions to, switch to this angle or swing over here or pan up and down, like, tilt up and down. But what's going through your mind as you're doing that? Is it all instinct, or is there like, what's the process behind that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you. It's mostly flow. Like, as unsatisfying as an answer as that is, I think it's just like, it is 12 years of having done that dance a lot with a lot of people, from everything from athletes to musicians to whatever else. Because it is like not to toot my own horn, but it's like that's the only time he did that. Like, there's no rehearsal. There's no, what are you going to do? Like, it's just like, it's one of those, he's working out, hanging out with Jesse, I'm shooting stuff, and I was just like, we're just going to rip this. I don't know that even, I guess the more honest side of that is, it wasn't like, oh, I'm going to do this really sick oneer here. It was more like, okay, he's testing this workout. And I did have in my mind, like, this could be an interesting story element where we go back and forth between the test and the actual event. That's like, how the tests go, how did the event go? And part of the reason that I wanted to be so present with it was that I have this feeling that a lot of the times in any sport, but especially CrossFit, we're viewing it from such a like disembodied perspective. You're so far away, and it's easy to be like, oh, these guys are they're just super fit, and this is just easy for them, or whatever else. And it's like, it's not, it's not pleasant no matter what level you're at. And so I really wanted to capture this sense of the intimate suffering of what it is that they're really going through. Because I knew that we weren't going to get that on the event floor, that we're just not going to be close enough. And so that was, I think, the intention for me was, I want to be really close. I want this to feel really just sort of present. And that was the reason that I ended up playing it as a one or in the edit, was there's a few story reasons for me. One is that it shows you how long 4 minutes is. Because there is a little bit of like, I almost wanted the audience to like look at the clock and be like, oh, we're still doing this, huh? Like, 4 minutes doesn't sound like a lot of time, but when you're watching the breathing, the re-racking, the how much that like 5 seconds of putting the bar down and taking a breath before you go back to it, like, I sort of wanted it to be anxiety inducing. But it was part of this meta narrative of just like how much we take that experience for granted and really putting people in that thing. But yeah, I mean, to answer your real question, there's no trick. I think it's just like being aware, seeing what's going on, having a little bit of an intuition for like, there's definitely a sense where I'm like aware of where Jesse is. I'm aware of where the bar is going to come down. It's funny. There is one point, it might be right at the end there, where he says heads up. And he was worried that he was going to drop the bar on me. And I was very aware of what was going on. And I was like, it's going to be close, but we're going to be fine. But yeah, I think it's having a sense of the flow of it. And yeah, I don't have a good answer for it other than that. Lots of handheld focus pulling practice that you can just do that and not jack it up.
Yeah. Yeah. I do want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about On Choosing Violence, because that was another project of yours that really stood out to me. I think about it all the time, but it's such a simple, film. It's about choosing not to retaliate, even if it's completely justified. It's in self-defense. Stylistically, it's very interesting because you shot black and white. It's largely just an interview sort of setup, just A-roll, talking head. But there's some other things interspersed in there. But what strikes me about it is there's a lot that we don't see. We don't see, pictures from when it happened. We don't see any sort of recreation. There's even, I think at one point, Dennis pulls out some pictures and he's looking at them and we never see them up close. We see them from further away. We see them sort of obscured. And I think that makes it, in a lot of ways, it makes it more real because the story is happening. I'm watching this, but it's also happening in my head. So it's very close to me because I'm imagining it as he's talking about it. But there's this sort of withholding of information. So I'm curious as to, what your thought process is behind that, deciding to go that route and go with that style. And maybe even, you can jump back and talk about where this even came from, where this film came from.
Yeah. I appreciate all of that, man. That was all definitely very intentional. Where this film came from for me was I'd been wanting to do another mini doc just as like a personal thing. And I had recently had an experience in my life where I had a stomach bug. I got up at like 2 a.m. feeling like I was going to go throw up. And basically got to the bathroom and immediately passed out, just like totally blacked out, head first sack of potatoed onto a tile floor, sort of like woke up and was groggy and cold and peeling myself up off the floor, and I passed out again. And it had like woken my wife up. She's like trying to open the bathroom door and I'm just like unconscious against the door. And I had this very clear moment of like, I might be dying right now. I don't know what's going on. And I had a few similar experiences. I was in a motorcycle accident when I was 18. And it was a funny, similar experience in that when this stomach bug thing happened, I remember my first thought was, I'm going to have to reschedule my podcast for tomorrow. And then my second thought was, I might be dying. And when I was in the motorcycle accident, it was, I'm going to be late for youth group. And also, do I still have all my limbs? And thankfully I did. But I had this weird, I don't want to say weird. I just had this thing that I was like, I feel like I need to talk about mortality with someone, which is another like interesting. I find that all of my best doc work always comes out of some synchronicity of me and the talent are unpacking the thing together. That it's not really a disembodied, like the Chandler thing was very much, I also struggle with this thing of like how I'm perceived versus the reality of what I'm doing. I struggle with, we both grew up with all this perceived pressure to be successful and like we're sort of in it together now. We're almost mutually therapizing through this story together. And so I was seeking that out at this point where I was like, I need to talk to someone about this whole thing that we don't talk about with dying. And so I reached out to, Dennis and I have a mutual friend named Michaela, who's awesome. She's an artist. She runs a nonprofit now, but she was diagnosed a while back with Lyme disease, and she has had a hell of a run with Lyme disease, but just like hospitalized, all sorts of treatments. She used to have seizures and all of this stuff, and I was just like, Michaela's the kind of person who would definitely talk about like the reality of knowing that you're dying. And it was also the Music Bed like film festival, I think, was going on. And so in the back of our mind, it was like, oh, this might be like a Music Bed doc. So we had a meeting with Michaela, Dennis and Michaela and I got together, and it sort of very quickly was just apparent that like Michaela was almost on the other side of the hump where she was like focused on nonprofit stuff, focused on helping people. Her treatment had been going well. And I was like, this story's interesting, but it's not it. It's back to the story that's there thing. It's like, she's not in the place to go into this thing. And literally in that conversation, it came up that Dennis was about to have the hearing, the final hearing that was like closing the box on this stabbing experience that had happened a few years ago at this point. And it honestly, in hindsight, it feels like something out of a movie, but where it's just like my attention was like, oh, Dennis is the guy who I have to talk to about dying. And he did not want to. Like, even worse than the Chandler thing, he did not want us to tell that story. And for very similar reasons, that he was like, I don't like my problems aren't real problems. I don't want to be like perceived as a victim. You know, all normal stuff, but it was just sort of like I think, you know, it's still one of the things that I enjoy about the film is that it is a little unsatisfying. I would maybe slightly disagree with you that I don't know that it's even a film about not retaliating so much as it is a film about how desperately we try to oversimplify that into a violence or not violence thing, and the reality that it all sucks. And that even in hindsight, I think Dennis is still in a place of like, I'm kind of glad that I didn't kill him, but also I don't love any of this. Like there's no, and that's sort of where he was like, I don't want to be a poster child of pacifism because I don't know that I am. And so it was a very like murky, complicated thing. And so I sort of had to talk him into it. And similar to the Chandler thing, I was like, here's the deal. We're going to do this. I would love for you to humor me. If you don't like it, we're not going to put it out. You have final say on if you're not happy with it, it's going to die. And I'm willing to, I think it'll be a fun experience for us either way. And that was actually interesting because that constraint of having a very serious awareness that like this may never go anywhere reframed my process to I want this experience, the experience of capturing this is the game, because this may be all we ever get. So how we constructed that production as an experience was in some ways more important than the like edit or story was ever going to be. And so it was an interesting hybrid because it is sort of like performance art mixed with documentary filmmaking. And so long story short, he said yes. And so he was going to have this hearing. And so for me, the curiosity became, to me, it was a story on opening and closing the box on this experience. That you've had this traumatic experience in your life, you're having the final hearing finally, so that door is getting closed. But in this story, it's sort of a microcosm of opening and closing that box again. And so that was the construct that was like, we're gonna, you know, there's a seamless that you can see off of, and in my, you know, artsy thing, it was like, this is a box, we're gonna have a literal box that you're opening. The video is in and of itself a box, but it's like a nesting doll of boxes of unpacking this thing. And seeing what comes out of it. And it was another thing that was like, I just am going to have to pull the thread here and see what comes out. Because I don't really know. I don't know that Dennis knows how he feels. I definitely don't know how he feels. And so we ended up setting up this interview day setup thing in my living room. My buddy Billy came out and ran BCam. And that was the construct. And so we were like, okay, I want you to wear the suit that you wore to the last hearing. We're gonna pull up this he went and got the evidence bags from the police station because they became eligible to be picked up. And so that's one of the things that you sort of see but you don't know what it is, where he's opening these bags and he pulls out his jeans, and it was gross because it was like 2-year-old blood caked, like it stank. But that was an intentional decision, was like, we want to pull all these pieces. So I had a box with photo prints I had done a photo shoot with him about a year before that was sort of a retrospective on the event. And it was like photos of his scar and stuff. So it wasn't photos from the day, but it was more sort of in this interim portrait. And yeah, so we had set up all of these things, and then I had sort of questions I wanted to ask him. The night before, I was prepping interview stuff and was reading through his victim impact statement, they call it, which is like what he had to read at the initial hearing. And just reading that, I was like, this does a way better job of telling the story without getting into the details than me asking him questions would. And so rather than trying to pull this information back out, I'm just going to ask him to read it. And so that was how we ended up starting the day, was that he walks in, sits down and immediately reads whatever it is, so-and-so date, letter to the court, and it's all from his perspective. And coming back to the Chandler thing and the introduction of On Choosing Violence, for me, it's a big question of like, how do we stoke curiosity about what's going on here? And how do we feed a lot of like almost subconscious data about the story without, how do we be mysterious and not give away too much to keep people engaged? And so like with that, we're coming in and sort of pulling you into this thing of like, did he kill someone? Did he not kill someone? Like, you don't really know what's going on, sort of in the like, why am I watching a movie about a guy who loses? And the important aspect of all of that to me, which I feel like I've been bearing the lead on, is that I didn't want the audience to play jury. That I was like, what is the ultimate lose in this story is for people to be sitting there going, should he, shouldn't he? Because that is not the point. And so for me, every creative conceit was, how do I put the audience in his seat? That this is not really us looking at Dennis's situation. This is, we're going to put Ethan in the seat of, you're at a Dunkin' Donuts and you just randomly got attacked, and what do you do? And so we're not going to show the security camera footage, which does exist, because I don't need people analyzing it. It's just not part of, we're intentionally going to tie all the hands of all the things that your brain wants so that it can say, was this the right decision or not? Which to me comes back to that bigger question of what we want to do here is go, was this the right thing or not? Should you choose violence? Should you not? And for me, I was like, we're just going to tie your hands so you can't answer that question. Because I don't think there is an answer to that question, personally. It's an unanswerable, what happens, happens. And, we can retroactively tell the story however we want. But so we're going to do everything we can to put the audience in the uncomfortable emotional position of having to wonder and having to play it out in their mind and having to feel his emotional turmoil. And I think that's another good example of like the simultaneous real-time discovery thing, where you can watch his eyes process these questions. And that was something that was really important. My buddy Steven Lester and the Edit House, they did the edit on that. And we were very quickly on the same page, but it was like, you can't cut the air out of this. You have to let people sit in watching him think about it. And he had, I think, someone on his team, and he said, yeah, one of the assistant editors originally like cut it down to like half as long. And he was like, you just can't. You have to leave all that like breathy space of watching him weigh both sides in his head, and you watch him go back and forth, and you watch the questions play out. And that to me was the important part of all of that. Again, it's sort of like, I feel bad framing it as like a counter social media thing, because it's really not. It's just it is the kind of storytelling that I love. But I think that it was very intentional for me to go like, we're going to do all the things, we're going to break all the rules here. That's like all the rules that people are like, oh, you have to explain what's going on. People have to understand these things. You have to hook them quickly. You have to cut all the breath out of it. All these things people say on the internet now. And it's like, it's all BS. It's all just lazy, bad storytelling. And so we're going to go, how do you flip all of it and make something that I think is way more compelling? But it is a little bit of like, to be honest, Ethan, there's definitely a chip on my shoulder with each of those things, where it was like, in the arena, there was definitely a little bit of like, let's show people how you can actually do this again. Because I feel like YouTube docs have become just lazy. And On Choosing Violence was very similar, where it was like, doc storytelling has become so paint by numbers, formulaic, lazy nonsense that like, let's make something that actually just feels so undeniably human and real. Because yeah, those are the things that inspire me. I think one of the other pieces worth mentioning with On Choosing Violence was that, yes, it was an intentional decision to go like, we don't want to leave this world. That was another, I guess, like thought that came up was like, because we talked about like, do we do B-roll or anything? And I thought about it a little bit and was just sort of like, my honest thought was that it runs the risk of getting into that like weird middle world again. And I was feeling strongly about like, let's just make bold decisions. And so the decision was more of a limiting thing than anything, was that this all has to play out in this world. And so we can do anything in this world. We can open bags, we can flip through photos, we can, whatever we want, but it all has to take place here, and we're never going to go to another space. And the other piece of that I think is worth mentioning is that we rolled for like 3.5 hours on that, I want to say. And the first like 2.5 hours of it were not anything good. It was like the questions immediately went out the window because Dennis read the victim impact statement, and I was like, how does it feel to read that? And he sort of like looked at it and he was like, it feels a little like melodramatic. And I was immediately like, okay, this is, what do you mean? Like, but so it ended up being like 2 hours of Dennis and I playing cat and mouse with the part of him that wanted to be like, it's not that big a deal. And really having to like continue to have this conversation. And we weren't like fighting, but we were definitely like, it was an upside that we've been friends since we were like 14. So there was definitely a little bit of me being like, do you see that you're being crazy right now? But it wasn't until like the last, 40 minutes, which included, we did all this stuff with the evidence bags and everything at the end. So it was probably the last like 20 minutes of the interview where suddenly something cracked and pretty much all of the good stuff came out right there. And that was where it's like, okay, now we've got a movie. And that was when we cut it and, called it. But that's another thing that I've found that I would say to people who are maybe starting out in this space or even have been in this space and don't feel like they've been getting what they want is, man, patience is a virtue, as tropey as that sounds. And it can be really easy to go like, I'm a big fan of being surgical and going like, we're going to get in, get out. We know what we need. Let's not spray and pray. And in general, I undershoot more than I overshoot 100% of the time. But especially in these conversations, whether that's talking to Chandler, whether that's talking to Dennis, whatever it may be, sometimes you do just have to like keep coming back to that well, and you have to keep asking the question behind the question, and you have to get beyond that. Like, the thing that makes us special is community, and like just keep digging in. And sometimes you get there in 15 minutes and sometimes you get there in 3 hours, but to like, if your gut is telling you that there's more there, just keep pulling the thread. Do not move on. Just keep going, keep going, keep going. And once you've got it, trust your gut that you've got it too, and be like, we're done. Because I've had other projects where we've done like one of my old favorite projects sort of in this vein was for a music video for the song All We Do by a band called Oh Wonder. And there's a sort of like director's cut on my Vimeo of this guy Harry's story that we cut to it. And it's like, I want to say it's like 2.5 minutes long. But it's him answering the question, what does it mean to be human? And he talks about his son and, growing and learning and experiencing things with other people. And it is one unedited interview question, period. And it was like, we asked him that question. He gave us a soundbite and it was like, it's not getting any better than this. Calling it, went back to the edit, dropped that thing in, put the B-roll over, and we're like, we're done. And so I think it's really easy to fall into the trap of either feeling like you have to keep you have to keep the show going, right? That it's like, oh, well, we set up this whole thing, so we might as well be here all day. We got to fill a 10-hour day, or vice versa, to be like, oh, well, we scheduled 20 minutes. So if we don't have it in 20 minutes, we're moving on. And like to actually just listen to the moment and listen to the story that's there, and to be present with that thing, and to go like, okay, we're going to punt a B-roll scene so that we can continue getting what we need, or we're going to call it because this is way more compelling than the story we came in with our heads. Like, follow the thread that's in front of you will always lead to the best thing.
If you were to talk to 18-year-old Evan, maybe just give one or two pieces of advice Could be about filmmaking in general or documentary storytelling in particular. Like, what are the things that you feel like those are just, you gotta have that, or you gotta know this?
I don't know. There's a part of me that's like, aphorisms are so silly, but I think it's true that following your curiosity, like trusting your curiosity, that's something that honestly I think 18-year-old Evan was pretty good at, and that I mostly lost a little bit in the middle of my 20s because I got into agency production world that was very like, it just wasn't curiosity based, and it's something that I've had to come back to. Trusting your curiosity, trusting your gut, trusting your sense of emotional resonance. Like if something feels like it's not compelling, honestly, I think that's a good thing to trust and like find something that is compelling. Ask uncomfortable questions. Like the best question to ask is the one that you feel like you shouldn't ask. And that's true of on-camera interviews. That's true of client conversations. Like, I think that's one of my personal secret weapons in my career, is that I'm consistently willing to ask questions that people look at me like I'm crazy. And there's a lot of power. There's a lot of power in that. And I mean, I think that in many ways, these films that we're talking about are films that ask questions that are uncomfortable to ask, right? That it's like, no one wants to talk about like, how do we deal with losing? No one wants to talk about with like, what do you do when you randomly get violence committed to you? And maybe your violence wasn't a gang member in a Dunkin' Donuts. Maybe your violence was your uncle when you were 14. Maybe it was the boss that you had at your first job. Like we've all had some version of like, I didn't deserve this and I randomly became the subject of someone's wrath. But those are the questions that I find really compelling to ask. And a lot of the times it's vulnerable because the questions that, the ability to see those things requires you to be honest about what's uncomfortable, and where you're at, and to go like, this is what I'm curious about and that I don't have totally resolved. And I think that's one of the other big things is like, don't feel like you have to have the answers, because I think so much, one, just like in life, but especially in content right now, it's really easy to go into this world of like, let's have ChatGPT give us 20 answers for things to say. And I, as a creator, storyteller, artist, whatever you want to call it, am a big believer in questions being way more important than answers. And so like the stories that I tell are always focused on questions. And if we're in the, like, even to quickly divert back to the unsung heroes thing, which was the employee thank you piece, to me, the question behind that film was, what is the world of waste and recycling employees? Because these people, we don't see any of it. It secretly runs so much of our lives. And if anything, we see the like billboard of a trash truck out in front of a green field. But like, what if we were to actually dig into the reality of these people's everyday life and put it on a screen with the same respect and care that we would an athlete or anything else? And so the film comes out of a curiosity about, what is your experience? What is your life like? What matters to you? Why do you do the things that you do? And there can be a trap to go like, I am the expert, I'm the film person, I'm the person who knows the story framework, and so this is what we should be doing. And yes, we are experts. Yes, we are people we have to make bold decisions. We have to do all these things, but to always ground it in a sense of curiosity, because the curiosity, if you're not learning, you're probably not telling a very good story. And so use the curiosity, ask the questions that are uncomfortable, follow what you don't know and what you want to know more about and understand, and be willing to like learn at the same time that the talent is learning, at the same time that the audience is learning. Because at the end of the day, that is all of this storytelling stuff is in pursuit of the emotional experience and the growth behind it. And that's my biggest personal caveat to quote unquote AI filmmaking, is like, it's not that the films won't be good. It's that I don't change when I make an AI film. And every other film that I've made has changed me as a person. And I think that's the true mechanism. Like, that's what I love about it. It's a weird alchemical thing that I become a different person every time I have to make something. And if you take that experience out, I don't know what the point is. Honestly, I just don't. Like, I don't think that videos for the sake of the images and the audio and the views matter at all. And so I'm not an like old guy screaming at a cloud, like AI is going to do what it's going to do. But for me, I ground all of this in like the personal experience of learning to see a different perspective, to come at things with compassion, and to sit with people where they are, you know? And part of that too is like, I guess the last thing I would add to that is to be, to learn to connect with people without becoming enmeshed in people. And I think some of that, like, maybe it's a therapy thing, maybe it's an emotional maturity thing, but like compassion is being able to be okay with everything that's going on for someone without having to do anything about it. And I've seen a lot of people who like will get into uncomfortable interviews and they immediately start backing out of it. You know, it's like someone starts crying and someone leans in and is like, oh, don't worry, we're not going to use any of this. And it's like, you're only saying that for yourself and you're ruining the moment. And that like another superpower is shutting the hell up. Just let it play out. Like, just don't do anything. Let the person have the meltdown. Let them sit there and process the question. Let them, whatever it is, just be silent. And that skill alone, sitting in interviews and learning to just shut up and let things play out and to not connect, not to put yourself in that person's shoes, but to be willing to just observe it play out, you'll get so much more magic than if you're constantly cutting your own feed off, which I just see people do all the time. It makes me crazy.
Well, Evan, this has been absolutely incredible. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you for being willing to answer all my questions. And where can people find you if they're interested in learning more about what it is that you do?
So it's a great question. My internet presence is kind of a mess lately. I mean, I'm on the things. I'm on Instagram and Facebook and all that jazz, trying to use them less, which is another conversation for another day. But yeah, so like my personal website is ebourcier.com. Take a stab at Googling it and something will come up. It's not worth spelling right. My Instagram is the same. The Challenger website is challengermediahouse.com. It is like in desperate need of a facelift, which, you know, that's the classic conundrum of all of us, right? That's like, you're either making stuff or working on that stuff. But yeah, happy to talk to anyone, happy to talk about this more. I really love what you're doing. I always love hearing these conversations and really talking more about the process. Because at least when I was starting out, it's like, that's the thing that didn't make any sense, is like, how do you make the decisions? And I love listening to how people make decisions, what people prioritize, you know, what they're leaning into, what they're leaning away from. And it's super cool to see someone doing this. So I'm always happy to come on and talk about other projects too, or if anyone else wants to DM me or anything, I'm happy to help. Cool.
Thanks, Evan. I know you've been a big inspiration for me, and I know lots of other people as well. So I appreciate that openness to sharing.
I'm so grateful for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. One thing that Evan talked about was following your curiosity as a filmmaker. And in some ways, I feel like that's what I'm doing with this podcast. I want to learn as much as I possibly can about documentary storytelling, about the craft of telling a good story. And I'm doing that through conversations with people who are doing really amazing work in the documentary world. And my hope is that I can become the best filmmaker that I can be. And I hope that there's something here that's helpful for you as well. So if this is something that you're into, I hope you follow along. If you have a suggestion for a guest or a topic for a future episode, leave a comment and let me know. I'll see you next time.